In this video, we're going to compare the Financial Accounting Standards Board, or FASB, to the International Accounting Standards Board, or IASB. So the FASB is the standard setter that creates generally accepted accounting principles for companies in the United States. The IASB, on the other hand, is the international standard setter, and it creates and issues international financial reporting standards that are followed by companies in more than 100 countries. Now, the difference is that with U.S. GAAP, if you're a U.S. firm and you're listed on a U.S. stock exchange, you have to follow U.S. GAAP. You can't choose to follow international financial reporting standards. Now, there are more than 100 countries have adopted international financial reporting standards, just not the U.S., and companies in those countries have to issue their financial statements according to IFRS. But the IASB has no power to compel any country to adopt IFRS. It's just up to the countries on a country-by-country basis whether or not they want to adopt IFRS. Now, IFRS tends to be more principles-based, whereas U.S. GAAP is more rules-based. And because U.S. GAAP is more rules-based, it tends to be more detailed, more complicated standards that are issued. Now, fortunately, the FASB has organized those standards into an accounting standards codification, where everything is organized by area, by topic, like receivables, inventory. It's really convenient, and there's just one level of GAAP. If something's in the accounting standards codification, it's GAAP. If it's not, then it's not part of GAAP. However, the IASB has a hierarchy of authoritative guidance, right? With the IFRS standards, they're at the top, they're the most authoritative, and then the predecessor organization to the IASB, which was called the IASC, the International Accounting Standards Committee, the standards that they had issued are like the second hierarchy, and then the third is interpretations that are issued by this peripheral organization to the IASB, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, another difference is that the FASB just has 7 board members, whereas the IASB has nearly double because they have a larger board because they have people coming from all over the world, right? They have representation from countries all over the world that are part of the International Accounting Standards Board. So it makes sense that they would have a larger board. Now, I want to talk about the structure because there are actually quite a lot of similarities between the structure for International Accounting Standards Board and also with the Financial Accounting Standards Board. So first off, let me tell you with the IASB. So we have what's commonly called a 3-tier governance structure. And with 3 tiers, we have 3 organizations. We have the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board, which is basically, you can think of as overseeing this other organization called the IFRS Foundation Trustees. And this IFRS Foundation Trustees, they select the board members and provide oversight for the IASB. But the IASB is the actual standard setter for international accounting, international financial reporting standards. So the IFRS are actually issued by the IASB. IASB is a standard setter, but this foundation selects the board members. Now, there's an advisory council, the IFRS Advisory Council, that provides advice to the IASB about which projects to add to its agenda and so forth. And then there's also an IFRS Interpretations Committee, which I had briefly talked to you about when we talked about the hierarchy of international accounting standards. At the bottom, we've got these interpretations. And basically, think about the IFRS interpretations as this. The IFRS Interpretations Committee looks at different issues that are coming up in international accounting and says, oh, okay, we've got some issue here where 2 companies are accounting for the same transaction in different ways, and we don't think that that's consistent with IFRS. So they try and look within the existing IFRS and see if there's some way to find a consensus and say, okay, here's the way this transaction should be accounted for. So that the IASB, it doesn't have to get involved and issue a new IFRS. Okay, so all that being said, it's a very similar structure for the FASB. So I will change colors here, and we will make this. I'll try and make it as simple as possible. So with the FASB, we have a financial accounting foundation. So with the IFRS or the IASB, we have this IFRS foundation. Well, we also have a foundation for U.S. GAAP, this financial accounting foundation, which also is going to select board members for the FASB. So instead of the IASB, we'll just put the FASB here. That's the standard setter. And instead of the IFRS Foundation Trustees, we've got this Financial Accounting Foundation. And then we have an FASAC, Financial Accounting Standards Advisory Council, right, instead of the IFRS Advisory Council. So you see this is very, very similar. And then instead of the IFRS Interpretations Committee, we have something called the Emerging Issues Task Force. Okay, I got that right. Emerging Issues Task Force, EITF. Okay, so we've got a foundation. We're talking about U.S. GAAP and the FASB. We've got the Financial Accounting Foundation. They select the board members of the FASB. The FASB is this standard setter, and they create the accounting standards codification. And when they issue a standard, so we think about IFRS, what's the counterpart? We have accounting standards updates, ASU, and they amend the accounting standards codification. Okay, so it's very similar structure. We've got this advisory council. We've got the emerging issues task force. They basically, instead of calling it interpretations, they call it a consensus with U.S. GAAP. They say the emerging issues task force, they tackle some current issue in accounting and say, hey, can this be dealt with under the existing accounting standards codification? Can we reach a consensus so that the FASB doesn't have to get involved and take on a long-term project of trying to figure out the accounting here? Okay, so the EITF puts out flyers similar to the role of the IFRS Interpretations Committee. But you see, we have a very similar structure where we have a foundation, and then we've got this task force, we've got an advisory council, then we've got the standard setter. Okay, now I just want to go over real quickly again the hierarchy, because this is an important point. With the international financial reporting standards, we've got this hierarchy in terms of importance and what's the most authoritative. So with the IASB, the most authoritative is an international financial reporting standard. Okay, those are the things that are issued by the IASB. But the international accounting standards, which were issued by the predecessor organization, the IASC, that's the organization that came before the IASB, because the IASB wasn't created until 2001. So the IASC, their standards are still in force as well, right? So, but the most authoritative is the IFRS. Next most authoritative is IAS, and then we've got the interpretations. Remember, the interpretations are issued by that committee. Those are, we can think about those as number 3 in the pecking order. Now, the nice thing about U.S. GAAP is with U.S. GAAP, we just have the accounting standards codification. It used to be with U.S. GAAP that we also had a hierarchy of GAAP, and we go through and say, okay, what's more authoritative, what's less authoritative? But in 2009, U.S. GAAP was codified in this accounting standards codification. And so now everything, it's just one level of GAAP for the U.S. And again, we're talking about U.S. GAAP here. We've got this codification. Everything is just one level of GAAP. If something's in the codification, then it's GAAP. If it's not, then it's not GAAP. And so this codification can be amended periodically, again, when the FASB issues an accounting standard update.